Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to King's College London and the Climate Action Coalition's post-COP Outcomes Summit. I'm delighted that we are holding this for the second year running. For myself, previously I was chair of the Mission Zero Coalition. That has now changed to become the Climate Action Coalition. I'm delighted that we've partnered with Climate Action to form a new organisation that was launched by Secretary John Kerry at London Climate Action Week. And the focus of the Climate Action Coalition has been to convene governments, ambassadors like yourselves, business and industry, to focus on real-world, real economy solutions, deliver not for net zero by 2050, important though that is, but to focus on 2030. What can we deliver, knowing that we need to halve our emissions by 2030? What are the solutions that we can find, both in terms of policy frameworks or technologies, to be able to deploy those at speed and at scale? The Climate Action Coalition was delighted to host a number of roundtables at COP29 that included attendees such as Chris Stark, the director of the UK's newly constituted Mission Control, Dr. Vanessa Chan, the director of commercialization at the Department of Energy in the United States. And we're delighted today to continue this opportunity to focus not just on the outcome of COP29, but almost Janus face look forward to COP30 and to Belém in Brazil. And what are the opportunities that we all need to take forwards collaboratively together to prepare for the next COP, but also to understand and to reflect upon, as a global community, what were the outcomes at COP29 that when we can now utilise together, to work together, to forge those new partnerships to deliver on real climate action. I'm delighted that we've got about 72 jurisdictions represented in the audience today, nearly 20 heads of mission, and that's very much the purpose of this Outcomes Summit. It's not simply to have policymakers talk to themselves, but for the global community to come together in London to reflect upon what next. I'm delighted that we've got three keynote speakers: Professor Sir Jim Skeer, the head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Patricia Espinosa, the former Executive Secretary of the UN FCCC, and of course Baroness Patricia Scotland, Secretary General of the Commonwealth, that will provide a variety of perspectives on what has happened, what now needs to happen in 2025. And we'll be also hosting two panels, one on COP29 that I'll be comparing, and also a second on COP30 and what needs to happen at Brazil. I've always delighted to have the opportunity to host events at King's College London. After all, it was King's College London that very kindly hosted the launch of the UK's Net Zero Review that I had the opportunity to chair and publish back in early 2023. And I'm delighted now to introduce the Vice-Chancellor for King's College London, Professor Kshitij Kapoor. Kshitij.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to King's College London. I'm, as Chris said, the Vice-Chancellor and President of this fine institution. It's my great pleasure to introduce our post-COP29 Outcomes Forum. It's becoming a bit of a tradition, and we hope that it will continue, and we will continue to have your support. But I'd like to particularly acknowledge Chris and the Climate Action Coalition and the Diplomat magazine for their partnership in bringing what is a marvelous program together. And I'm delighted that not only do we have a great program, we have a distinguished range of attendees. Your Excellencies, ambassadors and high commissioners, business leaders, academics and civil society representatives. And as I looked around, I felt that we had too few of one lot, and that is students. And I was asking myself, this is a university, and where are they? When I can tell you where the King's students are, they're taking their exams. But nonetheless, I think we should make more of an effort, and that's what I'm taking away as my to-do, and I will return to it in a moment, is to get the next generation of leaders here as we speak about that. But what I can assure you is that we at King's are rapidly scaling our response to this challenge. Because this is not just going to be about some technology or new ways of storing batteries. The challenge ahead will require a fundamental change in the way we make decisions, what leadership means, what education means, and how research and innovation is done. And just to give you a small example of that, earlier this year we announced that King's will lead a new $5 million national climate adaptation hub, working very closely with government, with NGOs and other universities. It's led by Dr. Helen Adams, and the hub will assess how the UK can best adapt to extreme weather and other effects of climate change, informing a national climate change and adaptation plan. It's not just about adaptation. You are in this building called the Bush House. The Bush House is now home to the King's Business School, and the King's Business School has recently led a 40-expert ebook on climate finance policies, how governments could prioritize and accelerate the transition. But it's not only what our researchers do. I think the biggest impact that we as a university can have is on the 18,000 young people who walk out of our doors every year. And while we will contribute in so many other ways, I think the biggest contribution that we, and for that matter, every single other university can make, is to give a scholarly discussion and an engagement in the issues of climate, an important and a necessary part of almost everything we teach. Now, it's a big call in a university where academics rightly have the autonomy to decide what they will teach. And just to give you a sense, King's has 3,500 different modules you change. So just because a vice chancellor wants something, it doesn't happen tomorrow. But it does happen in time, because I think the ethos is there, our students want it, and we as King's are definitely making an effort in that direction. So with that promise, let me repeat my welcome to you. Now welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Sir Jim Skay. He is the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Most of us know it as IPCC. And as the head of the IPCC, Professor Skay leads the world's foremost authority on climate science and policy, providing governments with regular scientific assessments on climate change, its implications, and the potential future risks. So your perspective, Jim, on the outcomes of COP29 and their alignment with the latest climate science. Welcome. Professor Jim Skay.
Okay, thank you very much, Vice President, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's now well over a year since the IPCC approved the final report of the 6th cycle, the synthesis report in Interlaken in Switzerland. And as the chair for the 7th assessment cycle, I have to stress that the findings of that report stand the test of time, but the climate itself has moved on. As confirmed by the World Meteorological Organization, 2023 was the hottest year on record, with particularly startling extremes in ocean temperatures. And WMO further confirms that the world may have warmed by 1.54 degrees Celsius in 2024, with the best estimate of the long-run warming being 1.3 degrees, very close to the 1.5 number mentioned in the Paris Agreement. So extreme weather events and wildfires have ceased to be just part of future projections. They're evident on our television screens, and for too many of us, they're a present reality. And sea levels continue to rise relentlessly, with consequences for small island states and low-lying coastal communities. And all this, as we have clearly demonstrated, is down to more than a century of human activities, including burning fossil fuels and unequal and unsustainable patterns of energy and land use. Our last report showed that with every increment of warming, the world will become more and more dangerous. Beyond 1.5 degrees warming, new risks will emerge associated with sea level rise, permafrost degradation, biodiversity loss, water scarcity, more extreme weather, and food insecurity. But that can sound very hopeless. On the policy front, there have been some signs of progress. COP28 and the UAE consensus made a start on the challenge of transitioning away from fossil fuels. It established a new framework for the global goal on adaptation and operationalised the Loss and Damage Fund. There was obviously more halting progress at COP29, and the issue of financial flows was particularly vexatious. But the International Court of Justice started just this week hearing oral representations in respect of its advisory opinion requested by consensus in the UN General Assembly on the obligations of states in respect of climate change. So IPCC findings from the last cycle need to be interpreted in the light of all that's happened in the last year or so. And that's what I'd like to do in just the next few minutes. And I'd like to do it with reference to the 3 goals of the Paris Agreement. So first, on the long-term temperature goal, on mitigation ambition and warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. In IPCC, we've been saying for more than 5 years now that only immediate and deep emission reductions will allow global warming to be limited to 1.5 degrees. Now, quite clearly, we can't go on saying that forever. Indeed, the last UNEP emissions gap report was entitled Broken Record. 5 years ago, I said that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is possible within the laws of chemistry and physics. That was a very comfortable statement. I can still say that even at this point. But it's not just a single year. We are now saying that we are hanging by a very slender thread in terms of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, even in the long term. But it's clear what needs to happen, regardless of whether we are below or above 1.5 degrees warming. Once emitted, carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for centuries. It's the accumulation of emissions that matters. And in the middle of the range of scenarios that we assessed, greenhouse gas emissions peak before 2025, fall by 43% by 2030, 60% by 2035, and 69% by 2040, and reach net zero mid-century. We can't just pick a single year. We have to follow that pathway. We estimated in 2023 that the remaining carbon budget, based on literature published up to October 2021, was 500 gigatons of carbon dioxide, roughly 12 years of current annual emissions. The latest publications suggest that this may have fallen to only 200 gigatons of carbon dioxide as a result of emissions that are continuing to rise, but also some of the updated science. The latest emissions gap report shows that if action in line with 1.5 degrees pathways were to start in 2024, then global emissions would need to be reduced by an average of 7.5% per year, every year until 2035. And if enhanced action were delayed until 2030, then the required annual emissions reduction would rise to an almost unimaginable 15% per year. But to raise at least some hope against this picture, we've shown what's possible. In literally hundreds of pages, we've set out what specifically can be done in terms of energy supply, energy demand, transportation, agriculture, forestry, and other land uses through both technology and patterns of human behaviour. And most of these actions also yield wider co-benefits and can make positive contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals. And we do have the tools to bring these options into being. We have shown that carbon pricing, regulations, and other interventions have already resulted in gigatons of avoided emissions, and more can be achieved if policies and measures are scaled up and deployed more widely. Now, second goal of the Paris Agreement, let me turn to adaptation and resilience. Adaptation action has also increased, but the progress there is uneven. We're not adapting fast enough, and most of the observed adaptation is fragmented, it's small in scale, incremental, sector-specific, and focused more on planning than on implementation. Hard limits to adaptation, as well as soft limits caused by lack of resources and institutional capacity, are being reached in some sectors and regions. And maladaptation actions, which bring short-term gains but are detrimental in the long run, are also increasing and are disproportionately affecting vulnerable groups. The increasing gaps between adaptation action taken and what's needed are largest among lower income populations. And at the current rate of planning and implementation, adaptation gaps will continue to grow. Now, the third goal of the Paris Agreement on finance and means of implementation. There are manifest gaps between tracked climate finance and what is needed to put us on a low emissions and climate resilient development pathways. Only between 4 and 8% of tracked climate finance is allocated to adaptation, and more than 90% of adaptation finance comes from public sources. Adaptation finance gaps are constraining implementation of adaptation options, especially in developing countries. Increasing public and private finance flows by billions of dollars per year, increasing direct access to multilateral funds, strengthening project pipeline development, and shifting finance from readiness activities to project implementation can enhance adaptation outcomes. And projects that yield joint mitigation and adaptation benefits are a potential source of private finance. Now, meanwhile, though the gaps are narrower, tracked climate finance for mitigation is still a factor of between 3 and 6 below what would be needed to put us on 1.5 or even 2 degrees pathways. The gaps are least for energy supply, notably electricity generation, but greater for energy efficiency, transport and land use measures. And the gaps are bigger for developing countries. For mitigation, reducing risks and leveraging private finance flows through public guarantees, local capital market development, and building greater trust in international cooperation processes all have a role to play. Now, to finish off my remarks, what can we expect from IPCC during the 7th cycle, which began just a few months ago? Due to our rigorous science-based processes, that means slow processes, I should say, it will be some time before new reports are available. The panel met in Istanbul in January and agreed on the content of our programme of work, though the detailed timeline needs further discussion. By early 2027, we will be releasing a special report on climate change in cities, and the author selection for that is in its final stages. By the end of 2027, we will have a methodology report on carbon dioxide removal technologies and carbon capture, utilisation and storage, and another on short-lived climate forcers. And these methodology reports inform the submission of national inventories to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But during 2028, the working group co-chairs hope to have finalised the 3 working group reports on the physical science basis, impacts, adaptation and vulnerability and mitigation. And there's also going to be an update and revision of technical guidelines on impacts and adaptation, which were last produced in 1994. Apparently I was one of the experts that produced them, but I've no memory of it whatsoever, which is embarrassing. These will be published alongside the Working Group 2 report, and the updated guidelines will cover adaptation indicators, metrics and methodologies. And this may hopefully help to underpin greater financial flows for adaptation. Now, the scoping meeting for the 3 working group reports is taking place in Kuala Lumpur, starting this Monday. And I noted there are some people in the audience that are going there as well as me. And the panel is due to agree the outlines of the reports, the budgets and the timelines early next year. So just maybe to sum it up, the scale and pace of climate change poses unprecedented challenges for humanity. But our recent work has shown that we have the means and the tools to address the challenges if we choose to use them. We have a newly elected scientific leadership at IPCC, and it stands ready to play its part in supporting a move from problems to solutions and from analysis to action. And I'll conclude there, but very much look forward to the panel sessions that are about to follow. Thank you very much.
Also, Jim, thank you so much for those excellent opening remarks, focusing on problems to solutions. And we really do value not only that authoritative overview, but also the leadership that you provide, certainly for the UK, as an opportunity to demonstrate what we can bring to the intergovernmental opportunities to deliver future emissions reduction. We're now going to turn to our first panel discussion on reflections on COP29. So can I invite to the stage members of the panel that include His Excellency Elen Suleymanov, Ambassador for Azerbaijan to the United Kingdom, Kirsten Matthias, the Regulatory and Policy Director for the City of London Corporation, Emilian Gask, Councillor for Climate, Environment, Energy at the EU Delegation to the United Kingdom, Professor Sarah Bracking, Professor of Climate and Society at KCL, and Sherry Hickcock, Chief Executive of Climate Impact Partners, that we're delighted to have been a kind sponsor to this event. Please come to the stage. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to start, if it's okay, with Your Excellency Ellen, around Azerbaijan and whether you felt, your country felt, that its hosting of the COP was both what you intended a success and your observations on the outcome of the COP. And obviously, I always say with COPs, the hard work begins now. Azerbaijan has the presidency for the next year, and what you intend to seize that opportunity.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody. I apologize for my voice. If I have another cough attack, please forgive me. It's good to be on the panel with my colleagues. Thank you very much. When we spoke here a year ago, Azerbaijan was just announced as the future host of COP29 at that time. And you know that perhaps now in the history of COPs, we had the least time to prepare, less than a year. Now, in 5 days, it will be a year since we actually been announced as a COP host. So it's been a challenge. I think just in pure terms of logistics, it's been met with flying colors. I think it's been done quite well in terms of putting together the event. It also took place in a very different geopolitical environment from other COPs and from the upcoming COP in Brazil as well. I mean, just to mention that there was a change of government in the United Kingdom. In many European countries, there are questions. There have been a very significant election in the United States, so you could see this is a very different environment. And yet, I am grateful that I think this is in some ways, to the extent possible, this is a success in Azerbaijan. It was supposed to be a finance COP. It was supposed to come up with a new quantum number for the NCQG, and it has. It did so, and it was not an easy conversation, as you know. We could go into details of what happened, how it happened, why it happened. I think the op-ed in The Guardian by the COP29 president, Mukhtar Babayev, is quite self-explanatory. You could see the details of the conversation there. It was very interesting. For us, it was a great learning experience. But I think what the international community managed to do, despite all the distractions, and by the way, not all the distractions come because people want to distract. People want to do something good, and they add so much load onto a quite focused conversation that becomes impossible to complete it. So the fact that the international community has managed to keep its eye on the prize, on the most important focus, on the climate change, I think that is by itself a success. So I think two most important achievements, of course, NCQG with a 300 billion agreement on a co-financing annually from the developed world to the developing countries, plus a target of by 2035 to reach 1.3 trillion. That's difficult to imagine now, but I think the approach of bringing on board private sectors, funders, also the some developing nations, plus MDBs. I think it's a very good approach, and we were hopeful that it will work. And of course, finalizing the conversation on Article 6. I think this is fundamentally important. Many people don't appreciate how important this is. And the fact that it happened on day one, I think, moved the negotiations forward on other issues. Of course, the fully operational lost and damage fund is also important, and there are many other things, which some regional things happened as well. Chris, I know the much better speakers than me. I want to just point out something which is very important, I think, for as we speak to the UK audience. I think I want to commend and thank the UK delegation for being there. They were the key part of enabling the conversation and actually reaching the consensus. I think this is very important to understand. Whether one agrees or disagrees with the agenda which is announced and stated by Secretary Miliband, one thing is very clear, that the UK approach has been very consistent. Unlike many other countries, and that's one of the learning experiences, the discrepancy, what happens behind closed doors, and almost immediate opposite statements by politicians leaving that room. Azerbaijan has been independent for 32 years. We're not used to this kind of things yet. We should have, I guess. The fact that the United Kingdom didn't do that, that it was very committed, and what they said behind the closed doors was exactly what they pursued on a negotiation floor, I think is to the great credit. Also, the fact that Prime Minister Starmer traveled to Azerbaijan and personally pushed for the agenda on climate means that they are really committed to the stated goals of the policy. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Kirsten, Ellen mentioned that obviously COP29 was billed as a finance COP. You know, we got the newly collective quantified goal across the line. But what does that now mean for the private sector? What does it mean for the City of London? Where do you go next with what this outcome has entailed?
Yeah, I mean, look, when we think about COP, we think about it in two buckets. One bucket is the negotiated outcomes in the NCQG. The Article 6 outcomes fall into that bucket. Those conversations are political, and there's only so much the private sector can do to influence those conversations. And the reactions to some of those outcomes has been mixed. I think from a private sector perspective, it is incredibly important that an agreement was reached. And COP16 was a very stark reminder that sometimes politics can lead to a scenario where there is no outcome. And I think that would have been detrimental to the progress for the world, but also for the ability of the private sector to contribute to the financing of the transition to net zero. Absolutely, of course. Thank you. So I think that's the first thing. There was an agreement. At the end of the day, even though various jurisdictions tried to undermine the outcome of the negotiations, in the end, everyone came together and an agreement was reached. And congratulations to the presidency for getting that done. The private sector is willing to contribute, but at the end of the day, there needs to be a commercial perspective to all of those things. And that's, I think, the conversation that now needs to be had. How can that happen to unlock that flow of money? On the Article 6 side, I also agree it was incredibly positive that agreement was reached early on. We have for a long time been saying that carbon markets, voluntary and compliance, have to be a key mechanism to finance the transition to net zero. And with the finalization of especially Article 6.4, we now have a finalized Paris Agreement in that regard, and we should really be able to scale that market. And that is a perfect ability for the private sector to come in. On the non-negotiated outcomes, which are actually increasingly becoming important, our view is actually more positive than the media coverage might have suggested. There was a lot of talk about how business is disengaging, no one is coming, but a quick look at the numbers shows that it was the second highest number of blue zone passes ever issued after Dubai. So business clearly were there. They're not losing interest. They want to have the conversation. Now, it's also true that attendance wasn't at the most senior level, as we have seen, for instance, in Dubai. And some believe that is reason for criticism. Actually, I think on the positive side, I would say that is a sign that this agenda has really been mainstreamed. We're no longer in the business of making announcements and setting targets and trying to outcompete each other with the flashiest reports. We're now fully in delivery mode, and that was reflected in the conversations, in the margins of the negotiations, which I think is a very, very positive thing. So that's my high-level take.
Thanks very much. In terms of Emilian, obviously the EU played a critical role in the negotiations. I know they were initially concerned about the level of the finance package that was going to be delivered. What's your take on the overall outcome, and where do you now see the role the EU can play in making that finance pledge a reality?
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and thank you for hosting it to Kings as well and to the Diplomat. Look, as I think many have said, it was a difficult and complex COP, to be fair, and as the ambassador explained, it was always going to be difficult given the geopolitical context. And because it was a finance COP, like finance COPs are not the easiest to host, and yet despite that, we obtained results, yes. Results on finance, results on Article 6. One disappointment for us, clearly mitigation, and we were hoping that this COP would create a space to discuss how exactly we go about the UAE consensus and transitioning away from fossil fuel. That one is postponed or will be rediscussed. But on finance, yes, for us, it's the start of a new era. We have something very concrete. Now, of course, the headline is the tripling of the public finance goal, which we eventually reached two years ago, I believe now. We have more than ever other actors in the spotlight, so the private sectors, the MDBs. There had been that conversation about MDBs bubbling the past 5-6 years, more and more, and now we have a serious deliverable. We've also heard, we've committed the demands from developing countries on access to finance, and that these funds we've established disburse more, so tripling the outflows in the next 6 years. You will remember maybe that the discussions on the loss and damage fund, our position initially was to say, well, we believe what you want to achieve with these probably already exists from many different channels, and it might be more effective to activate these channels rather than create a new fund. We did agree eventually on creating a new fund, but we've not given up on the other aspects of what we were saying, which is that there's much more that can be done with the existing instruments. And so that this decision on accelerating the outflows of the existing funds, especially to the most vulnerable, is important for us. But look, the big hope for us on this 300 billion and 1.3 trillion is that we believe we can make much more per dollar. There are many things we know now that we didn't know how to do 10 years ago, or even 3-5 years ago, in terms of blending, in terms of working with the private sector. And that has to be the big hope, beyond the simple increase. And I'll be happy later to discuss the Article 6 if you want.
Sherry, can I turn to you and ask a question about Article 6? That was obviously, as Ellen said, one of the key outcomes that came right at the beginning of the COP. And it's evaded many other COPs in the past, again, an agreed negotiated text. For yourself at Climate Impact Partners that is involved in carbon markets, what is the next step now that this sort of framework has now been put in place, and how do you see that developing in the future?
Yes, thank you, Chris, for that question, and thank you for hosting King's College this event and having me here. So just for those of you who don't know Climate Impact Partners, we are a carbon project developer and retailer working across both public and private, working with governments and corporates. We have over 500 corporate clients around the world. So we see this and what the impact of this means. So first and foremost is we're celebrating the agreements. So absolutely we're celebrating it. It is the market really needed a signal to say we're moving forward. And we got that in that. So what it means now is there's more standardization coming in. There's how governments will work together. There's more visibility in that. And really having a UN-backed market that will have UN oversight, some say the CDM with higher quality, is really valuable. But the reality is, and I think as Professor Skate talked about, it's really about action. So even though, yes, this is a great announcement, the reality is it doesn't change the demand side. And there are a lot of discussions, and I celebrate them, the increases of the NDC commitments, out of the UK, for example, or you see in Article 6.2 more government-to-government bilateral agreements being put in place. But technically, money is not flowing to the projects on the ground to drive impact. And so my challenge now is how do we actually move much faster to drive to demand? And how do we use the standardization and not slow down, but really lean in? And I think you have some great ideas around the 300 billion. How do you actually start to mechanize that? But the reality is, especially in the private sector, unless there's a financial incentive, and I think Kristen talked about this, they're really not incentivized to engage. And I think whether it's through regulation that we put a price on carbon at the government level or some type of policy, or that there is a carrot put in place, you think IRA around carbon and emissions incentives, we will still struggle to really see some of that private money flow in, because their incentive right now is actually a slap on the wrist for taking risk and exposure. And so yes, a good step forward, but the reality is it's not going to turn into actually driving that 7.5 reduction a year until we figure out how to incentivize demand.
And Sarah, obviously a number of panelists have focused on where they've seen sort of priorities being taken forwards at COP29 and what might come for the future. What do you see as some of the key sort of priorities that were delivered at COP29 for yourself, taking that sort of broader overview from a policy perspective?
I think the first thing to say is to ground truth this agreement slightly, is to say that there are two numbers. There's the 1.3 trillion, which is the ambition or the goal, and then there's the 200 billion, which the developed countries have promised. And although there was an agreement, the majority or many people in the room were not happy with the lower figure being the promise figure. So the Africa delegation, for example, called it unacceptable. And I think this reflects maybe a 15-year pattern of two different paradigms clashing and it manifesting at this COP. So, for example, we're talking about different types of money. So, you know, and I don't think that we're talking about the same thing. So climate finance for me, or traditionally, has always been a concessional, grant-based, cheaper form of liquidity for developing countries to mitigate and adapt to a historic crisis that they didn't cause. And that climate justice narrative was in half of the room, and then the other half of the room was the developed countries who are trying to push back on historical responsibility and remove text that refers to differentiated responsibilities and put instead forward-looking from all sources, innovative sources, and sort of dilute that sense. So there is still conflict at COPs around those two figures, and I think that is what is going to go forward. So there's a conundrum, in fact. We're not talking about finance in the abstract, but finance that's owned and used by different groups. We're talking about finance that's coming from the public sector, which is still incredibly low, even considering the promises that have been made, you know, for the last 15 years. And then we're talking about private finance, which for many people is only loosely, you could only loosely categorize it as climate related. Much of it is private investment. And I think the loss of credibility or the loss of trust between the Annex 1 and 2 countries is that many developing countries believe that some of what is being counted is purely private market flows. And that in this stretching of the commitment to the 1.3, the developed countries are just counting stuff that is not technically climate finance. So these conflicts are very, very deep-rooted. So with respect, I think the presidency of the COP did a brilliant job in keeping it together. But I think that those tensions are going to move forward. And another tension that's going to move forward is who is actually going to pay, because it's easy when people are discussing a goal and the collective, you know, the new collective quantified goal is something that's going to happen by 2035, to forget what's actually happening today. And the commitments of climate finance over 2024, including at Baku, only make 228 million. Tiny. It's a 5-year low for climate finance. So when everybody is looking over here at this fantastic new target, what's actually happening is a very, very low commitment from the Annex 1 countries. However, to end on a slightly more positive note, I think if you look at it comparatively, when people talk about 1.3 trillion, they're talking about the cost of replacing stuff, decommissioning things, building infrastructure from scratch, from new. That's where the 1.3 trillion comes from. But if we look at it comparatively as a marginal cost of switching finance, which is already there, the 1.3 trillion figure suddenly looks very small and doable. So, for example, it's only 1% of global GDP. It's less than 1/100th of global fixed income markets in 2023. It's equivalent to 3,000ths of the assets of global finance institutions in 2022. That's 0.003% of money currently managed by asset managers. That's all that we need to actually shift to make the 1.3 figure. So I think the challenge here is, how is the private sector going to be nudged to step up to that figure, given that the developed countries have obviously fallen away from any sense of their historical responsibility? And I say that sadly because I believe in climate justice. But let's face it, this pantomime has got to stop, really, where one group come and pretend that they're still going to do that, and the other group come asking for money and never get it. You know, that sort of performance is a waste of everybody's time. So I would rather concentrate on the types of regulation from governments that can shift that money that's already there, rather than think of it as a new sum. So thank you.
Thank you. I think it reflects, obviously, on the changing nature of COPs as well, as the negotiated text gets completed. What do we want to see out of delivery and implementation, and then how that will be most effective for the future? And then maybe I could come back to you just yourselves, with obviously the COP presidency in Azerbaijan's hands. What do you see as the sort of the next stage of the COP29 presidency? Do you see President Babayev making any more comments or initiatives, or sort of going out to sell the CQG, or whether we'll see any more sort of emphasis on what's taken place at COP29?
Thank you. First, I want to say that I agree with the Professor. Indeed, we also would want to see a greater number. We also wanted to see a more ambitious approach. And not only us, there were other countries, actually donor countries, who were interested in this. But it's a collective decision. It's a collective decision in which, as you said, developed countries have held the line. And it's, once again, I'm grateful for the UK contribution, which has been very positive in terms of pushing it over. I think we will continue along the lines which we have announced. There are a number of initiatives, including mitigation, including loss and damage. And we want to make sure that during our presidency that is actually enhanced. It's actually not operational now. It has about 730 million by now in terms of pledges. Obviously, it's not sufficient, so we'll be working on enhancing it. We mentioned MDBs. 10 million mentioned MDBs. I think that's very important because from the outset, Azerbaijan focused on bringing MDBs on board. And I think the 170 billion commitment, it's not bad. It will be increasing because we will be working with them on that as well. There are many other initiatives, be it farmers, be it initiatives on peace and health and humanitarian affairs. There's a lot which Azerbaijani presidency will be pursuing. With a little bit more confidence, we have some more time at hand because we don't have to prepare for COP physically. But one thing I want to say, and I think it's also important, is that at COP29, one of the key aspects is, Professor, you're absolutely right. We have a group of nations which feels that they're obliged to pay something, but they want to minimize that. And we have a group of countries which feel that they need to get more, but they always make demands. At the end of the day, we need to somehow reconcile this, because if we keep talking past each other, nothing is going to happen. So one of the initiatives Azerbaijan has promoted and actually has submitted its own is the biannual transparency reports. I think this is very important because there's always an excuse on the side of a developed country saying, look, we give the money, where do they go? And without a good transparency report, it's very difficult to make a case for continued financing. Now this will be our period as well. We have submitted ours, we have encouraged others to do so, and I think that's the right direction. Also, the small island development states will continue to be the focus of our presidency. We will continue advocating for their well-being, because at the end of the day, they're the front line of receiving the negative impact of climate change. One thing, though, what also happened, and I think this should not be underestimated, for our region, there were so many unnoticed regional initiatives. When people talk about big things, 300 billion, 1.3 trillion, they didn't notice what happened in, for instance, in the Caspian region. I'll give you one example. Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan got together and signed an agreement on building a green corridor, green energy corridor across the Caspian Sea. So now, this is a region best known for fossil fuel production and best known for oil and gas. Now, people are talking seriously, signing an agreement of partnership on green energy deliveries. We're talking with Europeans on this as well. There is, for instance, a great initiative and partnership on sustainable agriculture and smart cities. So, on a local level, regions are changing. And I think maybe, I'm perhaps too optimistic about this, but maybe it's not just in our region, which people don't notice. Maybe it's somewhere else, and we don't notice what's happening on the ground. So I think bringing all these packages together to Belém, I think, would be our priority.
One of the things that also begun to be sort of teased out by individual countries were their national determined contributions. We see the UK published its 2035 NDC, 81% emissions reduction. Brazil, uprated theirs by 66%, I think, for 2035. I wonder what sort of some of the panel's reflections were on where we are going to be with NDCs, particularly obviously with the run-up to February, which is under 100 days. I mean, a million, where you stand obviously with the EU and the work that's going on there.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And well, we will have an NDC for revised NDC 2035 before the deadline. We did have European elections. We have a new European Commission since this week. So there are some of the processes we needed to rerun, and we need to work with the member states as well. But essentially, the previous Commission had recommended that we reduce emissions by 90% by 2035. And that's the sort of debate and discussion we wanted to have with others as well, and we will need to have in Bonn and probably Belém on how we go about this transitioning away from fossil fuel. And I think, as I've heard Jim Ski explain before, the point is not only to reach net zero by 2050, but how you get there. And the commitment we have is to have a steeper or at least linear curve so that you don't wait the last 2-3 years and hope for a miracle to cut to net zero, but you start before. There's a simple volume aspect of emissions. And so the intention, and it will be the prerogative of our politicians, elected politicians, will be to respect that feeling. But let me also comment, since you mentioned the role of the UK, obviously we found, and I really want to mention that we found the UK to be a very progressive and influential and reliable partner in the run-up to COP, at COP, and already since COP. And I think I also would like to comment on what I've seen the ambassador do and your team in the past year. I do remember when you had your speech here last year, and clearly you and your capital have seen the potential here and the importance of being present and active in London. I've seen your teams. We worked a bit together as well on one event. So good job on these, and now we see that the UK is also taking steps with Brazil, which we are welcoming. We are good allies on the international scene. One lesson from we had a very useful debrief from our negotiators yesterday, in fact, so very timely. One lesson was the importance of increasing bilateral and regional diplomacy for us, not just, and we don't just do that, but rebalance slightly the focus away from simply the COPs. And that will help, hopefully, take some countries with us on the road to having ambitious NDCs in the next three months. What's difficult, is true, is that some of the guidelines we were hoping to be available will not be available on time. So it complicates the task a little bit, but there's still a lot that we, the UK and others, can help with on that.
Kirsten, obviously the City of London is reflecting on Sarah's points around climate finance and the nature of some of how that 1.3 trillion or even the 300 billion will in the long term be financed. the Ambassador mentioned a number of side announcements that were made during COP. I know that the Corporation of London had an announcement made by the Chancellor during her Mansion House speech, which wasn't quite at COP, but was taking place during COP. I didn't know whether you wanted to reflect upon some of those other events that were sort of happening, and also on the road to COP30, where you sort of see some of the next sort of key stages.
Yes, thank you, Chris. Very happy to. And if I may just make one comment on NDC,
Yeah,
if I may. So obviously we really welcome the UK leadership by making that announcement really early and setting that very ambitious target. And indeed, several international stakeholders came to us and said that's the best thing to come out of COP, which of course has absolutely nothing to do with the formal negotiations. But I think that kind of leadership is really important, and to the extent that the UK and others who are deeply committed to that agenda can work with other jurisdictions to accelerate those kind of announcements, I think that's a really positive thing. But the second thing that needs to happen then, especially with that private finance lens on, is essentially we need to take these NDCs and needs to turn them into national investment plans. Because what private finance needs to flow is predictability, clarity, pipeline of projects, and a favorable regulatory regime. It's not actually that complicated in theory. In practice, it's quite complicated. But everybody will have to do that job. Every single jurisdiction will have to go through that process. So I really think there's an opportunity for collaboration and mutual learning on how to best do that. And again, notwithstanding that the conditions and the process of doing that here in the UK will be very different to some of the jurisdictions in the global south, again, I think there's an opportunity for leadership from jurisdictions that are ahead and will have to do that work. In terms of your question on the kind of side announcement, what else was going on, I think the first thing is it was very delivery focused. So I had the opportunity to pop into quite a few of the pavilions in the Blue Zone, and there were a lot of companies that simply talked about the process that they had gone through over the last couple of years. I was really struck by a fantastic conversation with Vattenfall, who talked about their process of producing fossil-free steel and how that is at the moment still twice as expensive as the normal steel. But they have this clear road for how they can get to a commercially viable product that some of their clients are interested in. And so those were the kind of conversations which didn't happen to the same degree in Dubai, and I think that's really encouraging. There were a number of really encouraging announcements by the UK government, which I would like to draw everybody's attention to. The point about the lack of demand on the carbon market side was called out, and we absolutely agree with that. That is the single biggest barrier to the growth of that market, and some political air cover for firms who want to do the right things but are really worried about being called out and suffering reputational damage is a really important thing that governments from across the world can do to help with that. And so to that extent, or to that effect, the UK governance announced a voluntary carbon and nature markets principles that help to get us into a better space on that and provide some of that political air cover. There will be a consultation announced on the back of it. It sounds quite technical and potentially a little bit boring, but actually if we get this right, that can really help to stimulate that demand. You mentioned the announcement that the Chancellor made in her Mansion House speech on sustainable finance. Some of those were mirrored by events that were happening in the UK pavilion. And one of those was to co-launch with the City of London Corporation something called the Transition Finance Council. Now that was an idea that came out of a project that we did together at the City of London Corporation with HMT and DESNES, something called the Transition Finance Market Review. So this was an idea that the previous government had and announced in its updated green finance strategy, and it basically asked the industry, and we were really delighted to co-host and co-lead that review. What can we do to really make sure the UK becomes a leader in transition finance? And so that resulted in a 130-page review. I highly recommend it. It's a fascinating read. That came up with recommendations for the private and for the public sector for how we can really scale that market. They ranged from calling out the importance of national sectoral transition plans, and for the industry to really understand what the plan is, what is the national vision, how are we going to decarbonize individual sectors to have that predictability and certainty here in the UK, but also all over the world. To think more about how we can use catalytic capital and really come up with new and innovative finance mechanisms. And so we encouraged the setup of something called the Transition Finance Lab here in the UK to allow companies to experiment with that. The third recommendation was around a greater move towards entity-level finance rather than project-based finance. Both of those things are incredibly important and useful tools. But actually, if we maybe swim back a little bit more towards entity finance based on credible transition plans, that is another thing that can accelerate the scale in that market. The fourth one was around credibility and the importance of being aligned in terms of the language that we use. A classification system, what is transition finance, what qualifies as transition finance, what doesn't, and we had a go at drafting an initial classification system in that report. And then the final one was around the Transition Finance Council, because at the end of the day, accountability is really important. We make those recommendations. We have the backing of the industry, who we worked with really closely in the development, but we also need some accountability for government, that they really go ahead and implement those recommendations. And that's really a key task of that council, to provide that accountability and to ensure that we make progress at speed, but to also provide a resource to do additional work where that is needed, because there's only so much that can be done in 9 months.
Sarah, you've highlighted some of obviously the challenges and frustrations that were felt at this COP. Are there areas where you saw opportunities for moving forward, where you saw potential new innovative collaborations and partnerships maybe being developed for the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the developing binary is not working to give developing countries access to finance, but it's an intergovernmental body, and states have a collective interest still together to prise open the doors of some other opportunities that occurred at Baku. So, for example, there's the initiative on increasing global taxation on private sector high emitters. For investors, there's a choice between this asset here and that asset over there. At the moment, fossil fuels are enjoying 1.5 trillion of direct subsidies globally. If the developed countries could get together with the developing countries and stop that leakage, that would tip the balance for investors in favour of the energy transition. There are also other opportunities in the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force, for example, in changing trade rules. And my own sort of pet idea is that Pan-African carbon export taxes, for example. If Africa is going to export strategic green minerals for the energy transition in Europe, why not make those into internationally tradable mitigation outcomes, ITMOs? I don't see why Europe should just have a carbon border tax, but Africa and other developing countries, who I think own about 54% of green strategic minerals, shouldn't try and change the prices of the future energy transition into their favour. So traditional mode of negotiation, I don't think, is working well. But some of these initiatives on trade and taxation, I think, have a huge potential, not only to restore trust as well between the two parties, because the key is government and regulation, I think, and rewarding that part of the private sector which is transitioning, while punitively closing down the fossil fuel industry quicker.
Amelia just really wanted to come in quickly to reflect on that point, I think, when especially on Europe.
Yeah, because also something happened on that subject at COP29. I think we are starting to go there probably from a different angle, what we've been doing with the US, the UK, Australia, and in fact several developing countries through the Mineral Security Partnership, is to say, well, we are ready to change the way we approach how we provision, supply those resources, and we recognize the need, the genuine need and a legitimate need from your countries to also go up the supply chain and not just export the resources or go one or two steps and that's it. It has to be our call card, in fact, if we want to change the way things are done and if we are serious about being a fair transition. On the subject of carbon border tax adjustment, there was that moment, a very interesting moment last year, and I keep going back to this, where within 3 days, and I don't think they're coordinated, you had an editorial in the Financial Times here and an editorial in the India Express, I believe. And they both observed the same thing on EU CBAM and said, well, perhaps we should either have our own same instrument or have some carbon pricing, so at least we get to keep the funding. And so, yes, excellent. That's exactly the sort of conversation we want to have, and we'll keep having in the 2 years and in fact 8 years until CBAM fully applies. The aim is not to keep that funding. The aim was always to restore some balance internally. It's an environmental measure, and to ask from our importers something we've been asking from our producers for the past 25 years. So it's a question of internal fairness, but there's definitely an international dimension, and if done right, there's something positive that can come out of it. And then on the slightly related question on what Article 6 could mean for established emission trading systems, we see what Japan is starting to think about. What the UK might do, let's see if they go there. But for sure, the fact that we have across all these topics on finance, but especially on Article 6, we have progressed that notion of transparency, accounting. We hope that will help across the board. You know, some countries managed to lodge their NDC headline target well ahead of the deadline. That was great. We really support that, and we hope that inspires others. What was maybe less noticed than that we did in the EU at COP was to beat the deadline on something else, which is our transparency framework, where we explain what exactly we've been doing, the figures we have. Now, the deadline is at the end of the year. Now, we hope that the others will also meet that deadline, but it's across the board by building that accounting, that transparency, providing the numbers that can help build confidence.
Maybe I could turn finally to Sherry. You mentioned climate impact partners represent over 500 businesses. What's been their reflection in your mind on COP29? How have you seen the sort of voice of the wider private sector respond to COP? And what do you see them taking away from this for the next year?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Chris. You know, I'll go back to the good is that a UN-backed market comes with weight, and that can build confidence. The bad is we still have a lot of disparate elements that disincentivize their action. And so as positive as I want to be, and I am a firm believer that carbon markets are a tool that we absolutely have to execute, and we know corporates agree because our own research has shown that just in the last 12 months, the number of Fortune Global 500 companies that have a net zero target has gone up by 6 percentage points, up from 39 to 45%. So we know commitment's there. But think about the target setting bodies. They're telling them not to use carbon credits to achieve net zero, or to only use removals and not do any transitionary type reduction activities. So they have one body telling them this. They have another set of bodies saying carbon markets are bad and there's no actual outcomes that have been that are really being achieved. And so as much as this is a this being Article 6 agreements is a very positive, we have to very quickly attack some of these other elements to figure out how to incentivize them. I do believe in putting a price on carbon, doing it through regulation would be one of the fastest ways, whether it's carrot or stick. But in the interim, we have opportunities to address some of the other levers that will incentivize them to act. So I think it's time will tell. They're still sitting on the sidelines.
Well, with that, our time has run out, and I'm very grateful for the panel for your reflections on COP29. Thank you so much for being on the stage. A round of applause, please, for the panel. We're now actually going to take a short sort of break for refreshments, which I think will be served in the other room, the South Room, and then we're going to reconvene in about sort of a quarter of an hour for our next keynote speech from Patricia Espinosa. Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you.
If everyone can start to return to their seats, we're going to begin the second part of this proceedings very shortly. So grab your coffees and teas, come and take your seats. We're going to start our second keynote address shortly. While we just wait for a few others to come back to the room, I wanted to thank also the online audience that's been taking part virtually as part of this COP Outcomes Forum. Your attendance is much appreciated, and I hope that you're enjoying the proceedings online as much as we are in the room. I'm delighted now to introduce our second keynote address. This is a virtual address that has had to be recorded, but hopefully it won't take away from the impact of her words. I'm delighted that we've had the opportunity for Ambassador Patricia Espinosa, who many of you will know was the former Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change between 2016 and 2022, when she did so much to drive forward and implement the Paris Agreement. And I know that Patricia took part in a number of climate action events at the Innovation Zone at COP29. Has been a good friend to the Climate Action and the Climate Action Coalition. So delighted now to introduce on the screen Ambassador Patricia Espinosa.
Thank you for inviting me to contribute to your deliberations on the outcomes of COP29 and the road ahead towards COP30. As the title of this forum suggests, each climate conference marks the end of a phase and the beginning of another. Growing expectations, tense negotiations, and outcomes that often combine progress and procrastination are part of this regular cycle. COP29 lived up to a pattern that is already familiar. The backdrop of negotiations was less than favorable. The result of the US election, ongoing conflicts in different regions, and the fact that 2024 was well on its way to being the first year in which the 1.5-degree limit is exceeded, all combined to cast a shadow over the proceedings. Despite that adverse setting, parties engaged actively and managed to produce a package of decisions. Most countries and stakeholders would have wished for more ambitious outcomes. I understand their aspirations and share their frustration. Nevertheless, we should acknowledge that the new finance goal will significantly enhance funding for climate action in developing countries. Much more needs to be done, of course. But this decision will help both public finance and private investment to steadily increase over the coming years. The completion of the rules of Article 6 on carbon markets, which had proved impossible in previous COPs, will help both to lower emissions and to channel greater volumes of climate finance to the Global South. Deliberations on the Global Goal on Adaptation offered a path forward on the issue of indicators, and provisions were made to establish a support program for the implementation of national adaptation plans. Other important developments included new commitments on energy, water, tourism, methane reduction, and many more. There were also areas of disagreement that will need to be taken up over the coming months in the run-up to COP30 in Belém do Pará. Three stand out in my view. First, the relevance of the global stocktake, which has given us a sobering assessment of our collective progress so far and is especially important as countries work on their new enhanced NDC submissions due in 2025. Second, the mitigation work program, which is closely related to the issue of our collective response to the global stocktake. Third, the Just Transition work program, which ended in a deadlock and demands greater efforts to come to a shared vision. COP30 will most likely have to take up discussions on those key issues. COP30 must also take stock of progress and double down on the commitments made in declarations emerging from recent COPs, including tripling renewable energy production, doubling energy efficiency, and transitioning away from fossil fuels, along with the initiatives that came out of COP29. The level of ambition reflected in the next round of NDCs will naturally be one of the central issues in COP30. And of course, we can expect the Brazilian presidency to place emphasis on new priorities, initiatives and commitments, including forest conservation and land restoration. Let me end by saying that at this stage, a positive outcome is that multilateralism is alive and well and remains the best option we have to address global challenges such as climate change. But its efficacy will ultimately depend on countries, companies, communities, individuals coming together to turn agreements into ambitious actions and actions into tangible results. Thank you.
I'm sure we're all grateful for Patricia's perceptive remarks, and in particular reflecting not just obviously on the outcomes of COP29, but what now needs to be achieved on the road to Belém and COP30. And that's precisely what the next panel is going to now focus on. As I said earlier, this event is Janus-like in that we look backwards, but also forwards. And I'm delighted to introduce, to come to the stage, Professor David Aikman, who's Professor of Finance and Director of the Qatar Centre for Global Banking and Finance at King's Business School, Professor Franz Berkhout, Assistant Principal for Climate and Sustainability at King's College London, who's going to moderate the panel, Rachel Bresley, Head of Energy and Environment at Ipsos UK, and you probably have seen on your chairs the report that has been launched today that provides brand new polling setting out sort of climate perspectives both in the UK and the US that has been done both by the Policy Institute at King's, Climate Action Coalition and Ipsos. Also David Harris, Head of Sustainable Finance Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships at the London Stock Exchange Group. Very grateful also for their kind sponsorship support of this event today. And finally, also David Southington, Head of International Climate Strategy, COP Engagement and Governance at the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. I'm delighted the British government has been able to join us today. So Franz, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And so this panel is really looking forward. We're looking forward to COP30 in Belém. What needs to happen between now and then? And the format of this panel is a little bit different from the first panel. So what we're going to get is 5 minutes or so from each of the panelists, and then we will go out to you to ask if you have any questions, and we'll seek to respond to those. So I hope that's okay. There'll be a mic roving somewhere, so that's the format. I think Patricia Espinosa has set out a very interesting and broad agenda, so I'm sure we'll be able to deal with some of those issues as we go along. So I think what we might start with is, why don't we start with the polling, Rachel? Why don't you talk about the new work that is with you, I hope, on your chair, that was done by Ipsos, and perhaps the reason we felt this was important is because, of course, the politics that happens at international meetings, international conferences like this, is always against the background of politics, within countries, and that will be, to a large extent, also determined by how public opinion is developing, and that there are waves in public opinion in relation to climate change, and perhaps, Rachel, if you could just introduce some of this new research that you've done for this meeting. Thank you.
Yes, of course. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. So yes, I'm Rachel Brisley from Ipsos. So for those of you who don't know us, we're a global market research agency. So we do a lot of polling in the UK and internationally. We also, within the Public Affairs Department, do a lot of work with the UK, EU and other governments. My team, particularly around energy and environment, with DESNAs and others. And so we've done this polling looking particularly at the UK and the US. And I guess thinking about why is public opinion important, and ultimately I think Patricia summed it up there about how this is, how we can move towards achieving climate goals is down to everybody. It's the impacts or people will feel in all countries, it's the fact that people vote, and clearly the public opinion is important there, but also the amount of behaviour change that's absolutely crucial for us to get towards reducing carbon emissions in particular. And so you've all got the polling in front of you and the stats, so I don't have to remember any of the numbers, which is great. So don't test me, I'm not going to put any numbers in there. But fundamentally, positively, more than half of those polled in the UK consider climate change to be of concern, a big issue, and just under half in the US. There's a big political difference here, more marked in the US than the UK. Sorry, it's Britain, I should make it clear, in terms of between Republicans and Democrats, with the Democrats more concerned, similarly in the UK, Labour more concerned, Conservative less so, and Reform very much not concerned, and actually thinking, questioning climate change itself. And I think the other thing related to that climate concern is thinking about the importance of COPs. So we've actually been doing polling since the turn of the century around the importance of climate change. And it generally sort of has been going up over time, but it has spikes and troughs very much related to climate incidents. So big flood events, whatever. COP26, it went through the roof. In this country, it went much higher than ever before and ever since in terms of the concern amongst the public, really showing how where the media's the attention's on it, the politicians' attention's on it, then the public does follow. And I think that was interesting, something in our general election this year where there was very little talk about climate and public concern actually dropped. So there is a sort of two-way thing about the public affecting the politicians, but also the politicians and the media affecting the public. Two other things to say quickly. One is around how much information there is out there on climate. I think it's very interesting that in the UK, there's a higher proportion of people thinking they have enough information or think the information they get is just right. In the US, less so, but also I thought quite worrying concern about the proportion of people that feel there's too much information, and that's related to that, and they think that's because of the politicisation of the climate agenda. But also some people just feel that other things are more important. Finally, one thing I wanted to come on to, which isn't in the polling, but was some other polling we did recently, which is around the public's views on COP29. So in September, 2/3 of the British public said they were unfamiliar with COP29, what it was about. A similar, sort of around a third, didn't see that much would come out of it, thought it unlikely that commitments would be met. And that, and really that it wouldn't lead to much action. So I think in the public's view, those issues around information are really, really important to actually understand what's happening on the global stage.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like now to turn to the UK government, and then we'll have two finance interventions. We've now got three Davids. I've never been on a panel with three Davids, but we have three Davids. So the first David number one. Perhaps you can just give a perspective from the UK government. You were in Baku.
Yes.
What needs to happen now in the coming year in the road to Belém, where presumably you'll be also representing the UK and doing many of the negotiations?
Absolutely, and I think maybe the first thing to say as well, I mean, just speaking on sort of Rachel's points.
If you could speak into the mic, that would be great.
just picking up on some of Rachel's point around sort of just the culture and perception, I've worked on COPs for sort of many years. I started quite young. This is my 14th, and I'm not sure there's been sort of a COP already quite as anticipated as what's coming up in Brazil in terms of, you know, the sort of the framing of what is sort of at stake, but also sort of, you know, that interest from sort of, you know, bringing the climate and nature agenda together, which we're seeing from businesses. So I don't think our upcoming presidency will certainly struggle with sort of that narrative. But of course, we have got a lot of those milestones we need to achieve before we get to Belen in next November. But first, just very briefly, because I know this is looking forward, but just to sort of give the quick reflection from the UK government on COP29. Of course, the previous panel sort of covered this very extensively, but we mustn't sort of understate sort of, you know, the importance of that work on finance, and certainly that will set the scene for next year. So I'm very interested to see what the other Davids have to say in relation to how we achieve that 1.3 trillion, because of course that is, you know, the $1.3 question really sort of in the room. You know, how do we have this sort of this Baku to Belém roadmap? We've got that certainty over the 300 billion. I think, you know, certainly that was a remarkable sort of step forward. Many of you might have sort of dialed into the session this morning with sort of Nick Stern and the Stern Songway work, but looking at sort of, you know, how do we start to achieve that 1.3 trillion, which of course we all know we need to mobilise. So we've certainly got a lot of interesting sort of challenges there ahead, and we had that success, of course, on carbon markets, which, you know, I'm confident will be a key part of that. The area which we know which didn't go as well from the UK government perspective, we would have certainly liked a lot more of that ambition on the global stocktake. I think that is very clear, and this is an area which didn't deliver. So that has been pushed back into Brazil next year, and that will clearly be at a very important focus. How do we deliver on that language which we had at COP28? How do we sort of keep that pressure on? How do we make sure we don't backslide? How do we keep that focus not just in Brazil, but also the G20? And this brings me on to some of my points around sort of looking forward to next year. Last week when I was in Liverpool with Minister McCarthy, she described me as director of magic moments. So I sort of, in that spirit, because my team looks after not just the COP, but those strategic sort of moments in between. So I guess sort of my sort of 5 to look out for next year. First of all, we do have the deadline from the UNFCCC of February for the NDCs. I think we know that sort of that will slip, but it is extremely important to keep that pressure on. Many of you will have seen the UK came forward with its ambitious 1.5 degree aligned NDC in Baku of at least 81% reductions by 2035, and by the end of February we'll be publishing our ICTU, which is a full detail, really, that breakdown of how we're actually going to deliver on that 81%, but we must certainly be pushing other countries, particularly the G20, to bring forward that ambition, and it is only sort of Brazil in that group which is sort of you know, up there with us at the moment. Secondly, we will be hosting the IEA summit in London at the back end of April, and I think this will be a really critical moment to push on some of those ambitions we need in the energy space, the doubling and the tripling. We will be expanding on our Global Clean Power Alliance ambitions, which the Prime Minister set out at the G20, and we really want to push forward on some of these key objectives around how do we make that energy transition better financed, and also looking at supply chains as well, because that is going to be really critically important in how we deliver that energy transition. We've got London Climate Action Week coming up in the summer, and we were just talking around sort of how critical that event now is becoming. I think even more so with the finance theme, given that that is where the City of London really does outplay other climate weeks around the world. So I think a really important spotlight on the UK. And then moving into the back end of the year, we have COP30 itself, and I know there's a huge amount of expectation there, but I think, it is incumbent in all of us to support the ambitions of the presidency. I think for us, it will be really interesting to see how the forest narrative comes forward, particularly some of those innovative financing mechanisms like TFFF. Before this role, I led the nature campaign for COP26, and we certainly from the UK government want to make sure a lot of that ambition is continued and enhanced. And then finally, the G20, like I mentioned, I do think we do need to have a very specific focus on the G20, where 80% of global emissions come from. Next year, it is the first G20 held in Africa, with the South African presidency of the G20, and we know that the South Africans will have a key focus on a just energy transition as well. So that's a little bit of the forward look for the year, but yeah, really keen to sort of hear from the other Davids and then get stuck into some questions. Thank you.
Great, that's a really good map, I suppose, of what the year ahead might hold, and many of you, I hope, will be involved in many of those events and so on. So perhaps I can turn to David Harris from the London Stock Exchange. If you could just make your remarks.
Great, thank you, Franz.
All this. Yeah.
Firstly, it's great to be here. Thank you. I suppose really I'm the finance and business voice on the panel, and I suppose so thinking forward to COP30, what are the things which we're after and would like to see? So there's finance, there's data, there's transition plans, there's also NDCs. So let me kind of talk about each of those points. But before I do, maybe just by way of context, so I work for LSEG. Many of us many of you will have known of the London Stock Exchange, which is an important part of the group, but we are much bigger than that. So we are one of the largest financial data providers in the world. We're also one of the biggest index providers, and we're also one of the biggest clearing houses as well. So right the way across all of that, we're working with clients, business, banks and investors, and climate transition is relevant for all of them. So bringing that back to the points I wanted to make, I'll make 5 points in 5 minutes. So the first is that the financial sector is not only following the COP process, but is deeply engaging with it. And the reason for that is that climate change and the industrial transition to net zero is both one of the biggest risks, but as well as one of the greatest investment opportunities of our time. So that has implications on both sides. On one side, if we face runaway climate change, not only is it a huge impact on societies and ecosystems, but it's also a huge impact economically and financially for the system. On the other side, the industrial changes that are required to achieve net zero represent immense investment opportunities. So kind of trying to quantify that a little bit. If you take just the level of investor demand here, if you take asset owners, so asset owners are typically, so we're talking about pension funds, we're talking about sovereign wealth funds. So we heard about one survey, we do a survey each year, I've done it for many years, of asset owners globally, the largest ones. And we've been asking them about what they bring into their investment strategies. Slowly, sustainable investment kind of came up, and about 5 years ago, over half of them said that they were trying to integrate it into their total investment strategy. Roll forward to today, that's over 80%. Of the ones with more than 10 billion in assets, so the largest of the large, it's over 90%. And the very top issue for them is climate. So this is an area which isn't just of kind of interest to a part of the market, this really is the market. The second point I wanted to make was that to achieve climate transition, it's going to require private as well as public financing. And obviously that was discussed heavily in the last panel. Des has raised it here as well. And, and to achieve that, I think it's useful just to think about what are the current financial flows that are taking place. So looking at the stats which the International Energy Agency are putting out each year, so they measure what is the total level of finance and investments going into energy each year. And in 2016, we reached a level of par between clean energy and fossil fuel energy. So it's about $1 trillion going into each. Roll that forward to today, what we've seen is fossil fuel financing staying pretty much static, but clean energy financing slowly creeping up, and today being about double that of fossil fuel financing. Now, to get to where we need to be to keep the ambitions of the Paris Agreement in place, that's still not good enough. We need to get it up by 2030 to about 4 times, so up to about 4 trillion. The other thing which is really important to note is that a lot of that investment is going into developed countries and China as well. So China's putting a lot of investment into this space. So if you take them out, it's only 15% of that which is going into the rest of the emerging market and developing countries. So the other real challenge is how do we help, how do you scale that financing and where it goes? I think that's all energy, but obviously this is much broader than energy. This affects every sector. And that brings me to my third point. And the third point is that the financial sector needs data. We need information. We need consistent information. And that's why we're calling for countries globally to implement consistent climate reporting standards. If you look at what companies report today, if you take the largest 4,000 companies, so the companies in the FTSE All-World, we're now it's a lot better than it used to be. It's about 2/3 are reporting, about 1/3 are not providing much climate data. But even of those ones which are reporting, it's often very inconsistent, using different methodologies, there's gaps, there's inconsistencies. So that's why we've been calling for consistent standards. You have the International Sustainability Standards Board now. 30 countries around the world are moving to implement ISSB in their markets. We did a call to action in May together with a range, with 120 businesses, investors and stock exchanges calling on governments to implement that. So this is something that the markets are calling for and to get going on it by 2025. I should say it's not an excuse for inaction for the finance sector that we haven't got complete information, but it just makes, not only is it financially more efficient, but from a climate perspective, it makes it a lot more effective and efficient too. The fourth point was that we really need also forward-looking information to direct capital, and that needs to also connect with NDCs and national transition planning. So at COP26, and we talked a bit about that in Glasgow, that had the private financial sector coming together, and one of the significant announcements there was the Transition Plan Task Force to develop a gold standard for transition plans, which then could be used by companies to set out their transition plans in a consistent manner. That's been completed, and now, in fact, at the Mansion House speech, the Chancellor set out that there will be a consultation around that in the first half of next year. What's also really important is ISSB has taken ownership of the Transition Plan Task Force materials, and so because we also clearly need this internationally.
Nearly there. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
I should say also the NDCs is really important because that also provides the clarity to business around what governments are intending, as well as national transition planning. So that leadership has been important. I'll give very quickly my last point, which is that the COPs need to be big, and they need to be really big. So there are some which say that they should be small, they should be kind of climate negotiators only. We need the finance sector in the room. We need the business sector. Clearly, we need academics. We need NGOs as well. But it's a big tent event. It's possible we need cross-working. So let's make COP30 a big one.
I'm sure it will be. Thank you very much, Steve. That was really, really interesting. And some of those big numbers are very, very helpful, I think, to orient people. So finally, the third David Aikman, is a colleague of mine here at King's. So David, why don't you fire away and talk about private finance, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much, friends. I hope you can all hear me okay. I think what I'll say will dovetail with what you've heard from the other panellists, but I think I do have a slightly more negative perspective than my colleagues here, which is kind of interesting for the perspective of a panel and having a discussion, I suppose. So maybe I'll just start with what I see as the good news here, which is when we talk about the kind of scale of financing required, we were talking about 1.3 trillion earlier. That sounds like an awfully big number. Exactly as Sarah pointed out, that's like 1% of GDP globally. that's in the context of a kind of a bigger amount of investment that's required for transitioning to a low-carbon economy. The figures I'm familiar with are more like 9 trillion annually. That is, you're getting to kind of quite big numbers at that point. Something like 2/3 of that is net incremental required new investments. But again, we're talking about 5 or 6% of GDP. So it's feasible to actually do this, to kind of realign, reduce how much we're consuming as a society, increase how much we're investing, and kind of meet some of the pathways that the IPCC have called for and others. So that's the kind of good news, I think. Now, my perspective, I guess from a kind of realism point of view, is that this obviously to me has to come from private sources of finance rather than public. And I think all those trends are kind of going in the wrong direction if we're looking to to public sources in this regard. So the question then is like, how do you kind of achieve this? I actually like the way very much that Kirsten put it on the previous panel. You know, you're talking about markets have to respond to incentives. You know, of course, that's exactly what you teach our students in Finance 101. So how does that happen? And where I am more skeptical, I think, than what you heard previously is I don't think disclosure, and I know you weren't saying this, David, but I don't think disclosure requirements around the work of the ISSB, transition plans, NDCs, I don't think this alone, it's a slightly straw man, but this alone isn't going to shift the dial in terms of private finance. NDCs, they're not really viewed as credible, I think, these forward-looking commitments. How do we make them credible for investors that actually change investment flows today? So for me, you know, if I'm writing down like ways you can incentivize private markets to invest more in low carbon technologies, either in the developed countries or developing countries, you know, I've got 3 things on my list. So number 1, we heard about in the previous panel, you know, we've known this for ages, but it's about putting a price on carbon or subsidizing investment in clean tech. Is that going to happen to the scale that's required to, you know, shift the dial here? Extremely skeptical. So that's the first point. Then there are kind of other areas you could look at, and I think there are areas to, you know, be a little bit more positive where there is potential, I think, to kind of scale up significantly what we're doing. So the first is around the role of MDBs, multilateral development banks. This isn't a new point I'm making here, but MDBs have extremely conservative investment mandates and extremely low leverage ratios. So the recipe needs to be far more leverage from these institutions, the scope to do that while maintaining their AAA credit rating. It's a point that's been known for a long time. And far more risk-taking, so not investing in projects that the private sector itself will invest in, but kind of de-risking for the private sector. That is one mechanism that can be used to scale up private finance significantly. The second thing that would be on my list, so I used to be a banking financial regulator before I became an academic. And I think there is scope to look at financial regulation, but the Basel rules, and ask, are they in some cases a blockage to the provision of credits to, you know, positive NPV projects in developing countries? And I think there probably are things that could be looked at there. So the risk rates around project finance are kind of notoriously very high. There's issues around data quality, not data about carbon emissions, but just data about the performance of loans. So if you could convince the Basel Committee that these are kind of lower risk loans than they're currently kind of calibrated at, that could kind of have an impact. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you very much. So very content-rich there, lots of things for you to chew on. And we're now going over to the discussion period. So we have about 10 minutes, something like that. Perhaps, does anyone want to do a first question? Anyone? Okay, so lots of people. Perhaps I could invite you in the front row first, and then we'll go to you, and then the gentleman on the fifth row. Yes.
Thank you. I actually wrote a couple of questions, but I'll... Hello. Okay, thank you. I wrote a couple of questions, but I'll stick with one. Considering the discussions at COP...
Could you introduce yourself?
I'm Machenje Mazoka, the High Commissioner for representing Zambia in the UK. So considering the discussions at COP29 about expanding climate financing and the new collective climate financing goal, what steps do you think need to be taken between now and COP30 to ensure that countries like Zambia and SIDS can access the funds to implement our climate action plans, particularly given the new NDC deadline? Because we'll need that to ensure that our updated climate commitments are both ambitious and achievable. So how is that feasible without the funds?
That's great. So we'll hold that, and then we'll have one question here, and then one question there, and then we'll try and get some responses to those three questions, and then we'll go around the room again. Yes.
Hi, Anna Marie Slott, co-founder of Transition Value Partners. In the time between now and Belém, what do you think the one policy enablement or removal of the one policy blocker could happen to make transition profitable for people and crowd them in?
So what's the one thing you'd like to change or remove? It's going to take years.
Not over that time.
Is there something that could happen in a 12-month time frame? That's what something really tangible. Okay, your top thing. And then in that, yes, that gentleman, yeah. And then we'll have some responses, and then we'll go around again. Yeah.
Thank you. Ashley Bateson from Hawley Consulting Engineers. Got a question about the social contract, and it's really interesting, the data that Rachel gave. So what can people doing in the climate sector, the built environment sector that I work in, to influence developers and funders using the social imperative that there should be, that we need for climate change?
Yeah.
I think that hasn't got enough traction yet. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, really interesting. Right, so the first question is about the climate financing goal and how can a country like Zambia, in Belém, be assured that the finance will be available to set ambitious NDCs. Who wants to? Do you want to start on that?
Yeah.
Maybe David? Yeah.
Very happy to. I think the thing I would add to your sort of ambitious, achievable, investable, of course, and actually sort of making sure that these NDCs are investable is so important in terms of giving that real confidence that the plan will be delivered. We do a lot of work on this through the NDC partnership. At COP we announced an extra £20 million for this capacity building work in terms of helping other countries develop these robust NDCs. But the thing I would particularly point to, and maybe just to pick up on your question as well, because the thing which I would certainly like to see is these ambitious NDCs coming forward, particularly from the G20. But I think the thing for me which makes them investable and credible and that long-term policy, to pick up on David's point, is having an institution like the Climate Change Committee, which actually sort of tracks the carbon budgets. It actually sort of it charts that pathway. It gives the investor certainty. You'd hope it has sort of cross-party political support as well. But I think that is just so important to set a high-level policy like an NDC, which is ambitious, achievable, investable. And if you do that with those long-term timelines and have you have the sector transition pathways wrapped within that and good governance, I think that really is sort of, really good sort of keystone policy making.
Okay. David Harris, could I ask you, so you made the point that only about 15% of the private finance is going to emerging markets, low and middle-income countries. And we also, of course, have in the previous panel heard about the distinction between public and private finance. I mean, private finance is going to be a big part also of, Zambia achieving its goals. How do you unlock what needs to happen so that a country like Zambia actually, can feel confident that it will have access without, having new debt burdens and, all the nightmares involved there, that actually there is a sort of transition investment climate that, that is positive for them as well. What needs to happen?
So I think the first part, I think, as David from Business set out, was having that clarity from the country in terms of their NDC and their transition planning. Then on the other side, in terms of the finance and the investment flows, it's just thinking about the fact that you've got an institutional investor community, these asset owners and sovereign wealth funds, who at the moment have got a big underweight position to emerging and particularly to developing countries. They also have a need for diversification. They're actually wanting to diversify, and they've got an appetite for real assets. They've got an appetite to grow their exposure to green industries. So, what's holding them back? What's the barrier? And the barrier typically is about is risk. There's concerns on currency risk. There's concern over policy risk. So things to countries can try and address those directly. But also this is where people talk about blended finance. So they can unpack that a bit and explain. So what they need is they need to come together with MDBs and public funding to be able to where the kind of risk tranche of the financing can be taken by those who are prepared to take higher risk, but they can then crowd in a lot of more of this institutional funding. So there's been some efforts around this, things like you might have heard about the JETPs. There's been some efforts there, and there's been some local successes in South Africa, in Indonesia, but that needs, it often takes a long time, it's quite complex. Hopefully, as more of this gets done, there can be learning from it. But it's that institutional investor community that needs to come together, and how you join up that investment chain so everybody kind of understands each other, and you can start to get the investment and finance to flow.
Blended finance. I wonder, David, whether you could say a little bit more about blended finance and what countries perhaps need to do to create the climate. And then could you also answer perhaps the second question, which is, you mentioned Basel. A skeptic in the room about Basel. What could actually tangibly happen in the next 12 months? And then, Rachel, I will ask you the question to try to respond to the third question about what can firms do to also, work with the public, the social climate. David.
Sure. So, on blended finance, David gave a very nice explanation of what that is. It's combinations of public capital, philanthropic capital with private investors, essentially to try and de-risk projects for the private sector. The problem is the numbers are just way too small. So the numbers I'm aware of are, last year, I think was one of the high points for blended finance globally, and it was $15 billion, the flow, and only about half of that was climate related. So it's nowhere near kind of where it needs to be. It could be a lot larger, and this comes back to the role of these multilateral development banks. And, as I said, they need to be instructed to take on more leverage and to take on riskier projects. How does that happen? And, what could be achieved? I'm not saying their mandates can be changed by the next COP, but there could be a commitment to look again at this. They're owned by governments, by G20 governments. So that's where I'd be focusing in terms of kind of where you could really achieve a big ramping up of private finance.
Okay, so quickly, that's where you
that's
think...
The thing.
That's the thing.
And I wouldn't expect it's all done by the next COP, but a commitment in that area.
Rachel, quickly on, how to leverage perhaps some of the public sentiment that you find, because there's a sort of schizophrenia here, isn't there? On the one hand, when you poll people, they say, I'm really worried about climate, and I really want to do something about it, and governments should be doing policy, and I'm willing to make some changes in my life. On the other hand, there's a sort of sense of, nothing's happening, I'm so small, what difference will I make? I mean, how do you capture that, empower it?
Yeah, and there are also concerns about, I support this policy, but if it's going to cost me money, no, I don't. Or if it's going to have any personal impacts, I don't. And so I think there's definitely an element about education, but I think thinking about firms and social contracts. My colleagues in Ipsos who work a lot more with brands and the private sector told me about some research. I don't think it was done internally, but it was all about the whole commitment to ESG. And ESG is employees very much value it, consumers very much value it. But I think, and I won't give you a figure because it'll be the top of my head, but it's something like less than 1 in 10 companies actually build ESG into their corporate strategy. It's a bit of a, we'll do a few voluntary activities or we'll do a bit of this, but actually looking at how they run companies and actually having the ESG sort of built right into that is a very, very small proportion that has actually gone down over time, but it's something that consumers and employees are asking for. So I think that's a really interesting element.
It's a complicated dichotomy there, isn't it? Okay. So we'll have one more quick round of, because time is moving on. Yes, a question here. Then I want to go to the wings as well. And a question, lady at the back sitting down, and then another question here. So would you introduce yourself? Thank you.
Thanks very much. My name is Professor Chidi Oti Obihara. I teach at the Holt International Business School, just a mile away from here. That's my day job. I also sit on the board of SBTI, the Science-Based Transition Initiative, and I'm a member of the Bank of England Citizens Advice Panel. So my question, perhaps unsurprisingly, is really focused on finance. And I really appreciate all the contributions made, but the one from David is the one that I really want to amplify, because David was the only one who mentioned Article 5 and talking about incentivizing global carbon sinks. Carbon markets are very important, and we talk about it quite a lot. It's one of the issues that I think separates the G20 from everyone else. Lots of less developed countries coming in asking what it is COP is doing for them. I think that one of the things that COP can demonstrate, potentially at Bill M, that it does for them, is incentivizing carbon sequestering industries and places and people. If we could talk about that, I'd be super grateful. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And then there was a question. Sorry, George, long way to walk. At the back there, yeah.
Thank you. Laura Spence from the Centre for Sustainable Business here at King's. It's been really fascinating hearing your different perspectives. Thank you for that. Given that we're talking about being ambitious for COP30, I think there is a bit of a taboo about one of the business angles that hasn't been mentioned at all, and that's the oil and gas companies. While some may be well-intentioned, coming back to the Janus-faced idea, I suspect some are working quite hard to hold back the ambition of COP30. So I would love to hear your thoughts and responses and how that can be tackled and how business can be productively engaged with.
Yeah, very interesting, oil and gas. And then finally a question here, and I'm sorry for all those people running out of time here, but yeah.
Yes, good afternoon. Carl Wright from the Commonwealth Local Government Forum. I'd like to raise a question to the panel about the role of the subnational level. Yeah. And we heard from Sir Jim earlier that IPCC is producing a special report on cities, and having attended recent COPs, including Baku, I've noticed much more emphasis on what's called the multi-level, the multi-sectoral approach, not just involving central governments, but also local governments and mayors. And just to underline that, I understand the Loss and Damage Fund has for the first time got a provision for potentially direct access by subnational government to finances through the World Bank, which is being elaborated at the moment. We've also, just 2 weeks ago, I was attending a ministerial meeting in Baku on urbanization and climate, which is getting a very key theme, given the growing urbanization trend across the world. And my last point is really just sort of a reflection that when we had the delightful news about Donald Trump being elected, within 2 days, I believe, no less than 350 US mayors, some of the big city mayors, and something like 20-odd governors issued a declaration committing themselves to climate action under Paris. Right. So my question really is, what can be done between now and Belém to reinforce the importance of subnational climate action and significantly also finances, because this is what cities need to do climate action, is finances, also working with the private sector.
Okay, really interesting set of questions. So I think the first question was aimed at David Harris. Is that right?
Yeah.
David Sellington, sorry. Do you want to say something about carbon markets?
Yes, I will. I'll very quickly touch on all three, if that's all right. I'll rattle through them. I mean, I think Article 6 and actually having that achievement is, it's been 15 years in the making, and that should be really celebrated. For a long time, it has been this ethereal element of finance, and I think it's now incumbent on all of us to make it real and actually start making those carbon markets work. I think what is particularly exciting now for me is this convergence of what's happening in the biodiversity COP and the climate COP, because what we've just seen is some of these agreements coming around DSI. It's a digital sequencing information for those who aren't following that, but how do you get payments for some of these new innovations coming out of nature? In the UK, there's biodiversity net gain. The TNFD is starting to look at those financial instruments, and I think this natural capital element is really booming, but carbon is the most developed, and I think we should make sure that is the finance is starting to flow to give the foundation of finance. But what really excites me is when you start stacking and bundling that to achieve the finance which is ultimately needed to keep the forest still standing, because we know we need the forests to be worth more standing than cut down. And very quickly on fossil fuels, I mean, this is one of the reasons why the mitigation point has been rolled over from COP29, because we couldn't get that agreement to even carry forward the GST language from COP28, and we certainly don't want to be backsliding. I am quite confident. I think the global community will rally around this. We know the challenge there for Belém in terms of negotiations, and we need to recalibrate with ambitious partners to get that. And then on cities, I just point out, I had the absolute pleasure to be with Steve Rotherham and the Liverpool guys last weekend in the first ever UNFCCC Accelerator City for Net Zero, which is really fantastic. Another example of UK leadership, and they are using their special status to look at how do you decarbonise what is Liverpool famously known for, the music industry. And they're looking at how do you have a more sustainable music industry. And the thing which really excites me with City Action is you can experiment, you can go faster, and they're looking at what can they very quickly take into their land use agreements, such as getting rid of diesel generators from gigs. They can do that really quickly. It moves much faster than legislation. So yeah, huge fan of city level action, and I think watching the Accelerator City project from the UNFCCC in Liverpool for the next year, and then who knows where after that, is a good one to watch.
Your point about city mayors and governors in the US as well is well taken, of course, is that there are many layers of government, and they need to make themselves heard in this. David, could I just ask you about the subnational point as well? The degree to which you can think about finance, which is not just always at the national level, you always think about, but at the slightly more local level, so that it connects with this enthusiasm which may happen at the subnational level.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe also, like other David, maybe also just pick up a couple of other points and pick up the point on subnational and cities as well. So pick up in terms of the kind of incentives to finance carbon markets, also particularly high carbon sectors like oil and gas, which are quite tricky. How do we kind of achieve that? So what's quite useful is starting, rather than lumping climate finance in one kind of bucket, is starting breaking it down and talking about the different parts of it, because you want different kinds of incentives, different kinds of mechanisms for different parts. Under GFANS, this is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, lots of the financial sector in it. We came up through that with a kind of a category of quite simple 4 categories. So like climate solution stuff, then you've got like transitioning and transitioned and transitioning. So these are kind of companies which are kind of getting on track with their emissions targets and then delivering on that down towards net zero. And then you've got managed phase out, where sectors which actually need to come out. And you need different components for each of that. So for example, also on carbon markets, early closure of a coal-powered utilities trickiest. It needs to be incentives for that. One way of doing it is if you can get effective carbon markets to provide some of that financial mechanism for early closure. But for each one of those is a different aspect. Obviously, investor engagement can be supportive, but you do need to have the economic underlying cases for each. On And with oil and gas, there has been quite a lot of quite robust engagement between the financial sector and the oil and gas industry. So there's a lot more to take place there. On cities and subnational, something which we do, as well as producing analysis and data on corporates and climate transitions, is also on countries. In fact, my colleague Yako Kuroshi, who heads up the research teams over here, but we produce a thing called the Atlas. So this was COP29 Atlas this year. We've done it in previous years, which puts a kind of a temperature on each country based on its NDCs and what its targets are. So what's the temperature increase? But we also do looking at the physical risk at countries. And this year we did it for cities as well. And I think that's really important because so much population are in cities and so many change makers as well. But also, many cities face huge climate risks as with increased droughts, increased heat waves, hurricanes, etc. And so this is also relevant for the investment and finance sector because they are providing finance often through sovereign bonds, also through munis and through local authorities who are raising capital. So actually a lot of this analysis is also really important, both in terms of the actions countries are taking on resilience and on decarbonisation, but also at the subnational level as well.
Okay, that's great. We're going to wrap up now. Any final comments perhaps from David and Rachel, and then we're going to allow for the final bit of the evening to happen. David, any final thoughts?
I don't really have a great deal to add other than just to say that, given the election in the United States, it is obviously a big opportunity for the UK to take more of a leadership role. We were chatting about that before the panel, and I think some of the ideas you've heard here are things that could be taken forward. Yeah. London in particular, I think, has a potential to take a leadership role.
That's great. Good. Rachel, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think my final point really is around just really the importance for engagement and awareness raising of the public generally. Those of you who remember the Rio summit in the early 90s, think global, act local. This is exactly the point being made here, and you're far easier to engage people in their local areas and for them to understand what's happening than often on global issues. Because it just seems too distant and it's not going to happen to me. And that's something we've found a lot from our research, that people trust, the actual trust local authorities, local organisations much more than what they're told on a national or a global level. Thank you.
Great. I want you to thank the panel with a quick round of applause. Thanks, and I'll hand over to my colleague Rachel Mills. So, David.
Right, we get to the last stretch and our final keynote speaker. And my name's Rachel Mills. I'm the Senior Vice President Academic here at King's College London. And I'm the senior executive that sponsors climate and sustainability here. So this stuff is very close to my heart. Fascinating panel, and really great to see so many of you still here. It's my absolute privilege to welcome our last keynote speaker of the afternoon, the Right Honourable Patricia Scotland KC, known to us as Baroness Scotland. She is the 6th Commonwealth Secretary-General, serving in this vital role since 2016. Baroness Scotland has been a powerful champion of justice, democracy and sustainable development across all 56 member states that make up the Commonwealth. And her leadership is deeply attuned to the realities of today's challenges that we've been talking about all afternoon. And she's been a steadfast advocate for tackling the climate crisis that's with us right now. This is a threat, as we know, that knows no borders, and it requires that collaboration across the globe. And it demands that united action that we've been talking about. And her work within the Commonwealth exemplifies this, and I love the way she's tirelessly encouraged us to tackle these issues. She's talked about climate change reversal, which is brave. She's talked about sustainable development and leading to economic success, and we're going to hear about that from her today. And so under her guidance, the Commonwealth has been a platform for innovative and collaborative approaches that we can all learn from, and that's where we're going to end with her this afternoon. I just want to say a little bit about King's while I've got the platform, because we are deeply aligned with this mission, and what we've been trying to do at King's is that element of joining up across disciplines, joining up across boundaries, joining up across the globe, using our students, our staff, our research, our impact. And so we've been expanding our research programs, and you'll see some of our staff here tonight. And so please, if you see someone with a red thing around their neck, actually some of you haven't got your red things on, please do talk to them during the event as we take you across for drinks later on, because we're doing fascinating work in this area. But I'm not going to talk about King's in detail now, but please do talk to our staff as you get a chance to network later on. And so as we reflect on the opportunities and huge obstacles ahead of us, I'm really delighted to welcome Baroness Patricia Scotland to share her invaluable perspective. I want to thank her for her leadership across the Commonwealth. And this is a testament to the power of partnership that we can all engage with, however small, however local, or however global our influence. We want to come away from tonight with an ambition to collaborate better, more globally, to make impact. So please please thank Baroness Scotland for joining us here tonight.
Well, good evening, everyone. Particularly wonderful to see so many of your excellencies, my bosses in the front row here. It's a great privilege and pleasure for me to be with you. And I really want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you at such a pivotal moment of our collective journey on climate action. Pivotal because we know that the decisions we are making today and the resolve we bring to tomorrow's challenges will shape the lives of generations to come. In these discussions, we face a truth that is both sobering and galvanizing. Our world is running out of time, but not out of options. To succeed, we need to match urgency with ambition, complexity with clarity, and disillusionment with hope. And we must find the strength in one of the Commonwealth's most precious values, solidarity. And from what I've been able to hear, solidarity is what this whole day has been about, because it is only together that we can rise to the challenge before us. So let us begin with COP29 in Baku, a moment of both promise and profound reality checks. Now, many in this room will, like me, have been to many COPs. And we have to accept that progress was made. The tripling of climate finance by 2030 is significant. And the operationalization of the mechanisms like the Loss and Damage Fund represents a step forward. For those of us who've been on this journey for a long time, you remember it started in 1989 in Langkawi, 3 years before the first Rio Convention. It happened at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, where the Commonwealth came together and said if we didn't do something about climate change, it would pose an existential threat. And if any of you have not read that Langkawi Declaration, I would invite you to do so, because everything that we have experienced in the last 30 plus years is echoed in that declaration. And the Loss and Damage Fund was something we thirsted for 27 years before it was delivered. And it was in Kigali in June in 2022 that the Commonwealth 56 countries said we had to have a loss and damage fund. And then we went to Sharm el-Sheikh and we fought for it. And we got it. And it's important to remember Paris because the Commonwealth in Malta, in November, weeks before the December Paris COP, we said we needed enforceability, 2 degrees and a 1.5 aspirational target. And what did we get in December? Enforceability, 2 degrees and a 1.5. Why do I say that? It's because the fight is worth having. And as my father would say, nothing that's worth having comes easily. And I really want to pay tribute, therefore, to the presidency that was led by Mukhtar Babayev, because Azerbaijan did fight. I paid tribute to the Secretary of State, my dear friend Ed Miliband, for the role he played to ensure that the deal was done. And we all remember that in 2009, Ed fought too for the first deal. But for many, especially the most vulnerable nations, progress seems achingly slow. Small island developing states, or as I would call them, big blue ocean states, my boss states, and the least developed countries remain right on the front lines of a crisis they did little or nothing to create. And for them, climate negotiations are not academic exercises, but existential battles that they cannot afford to lose. And their voices rang out in Baku, calling not just for commitments, but for delivery. And they were right to demand it. I remember the Grenadian Prime Minister saying there are bad cops and there are good cops. And we need the good cops to beat the bad cops. And the Commonwealth, with its 56 diverse nations, stands as a beacon of hope and innovation in climate democracy and diplomacy. Through initiatives like the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub, we have unlocked over $384 million for vulnerable nations, with more than another 500 million more in the pipeline. But what's significant about that sum is it has been produced by a relatively tiny amount. That investment of just £8.5 million. Use dollars, I beg my pardon, because I'd love it to be pounds. So if anyone's burdened by money, please step my way. And then our Blue Charter and our Living Lands Charter have demonstrated that collective will, when we come together, paired with practical action, can yield transformative results. At COP29, we championed the implementation of the Loss and Damage Fund, not as a distant ambition, but as an urgent necessity. And I committed to work hand in glove with that fund to deliver change, and offered our Climate Finance Access Hub methodologies and expertise to help make it a reality. We also celebrated the voices of youth and indigenous people. The training of young climate negotiators and our partnerships with indigenous leaders exemplify the inclusivity that defines our approach. And I was incredibly proud to see so many of the young negotiators had been Commonwealth trained negotiators in every region. It's one of the benefits of having 5 regions of the Commonwealth is the sun never sets on it, but it means that you can be like Heineken. You can get everywhere, reaching the places that others don't. Now, we fostered new partnerships which harness the geospatial data to improve disaster preparedness, and we launched our Common Space program as the latest program with all the space agencies in Baku. And as a Cosmos agreed to join us. But let me be clear. We cannot rest on these achievements. The road to COP30 must be one of renewed energy and even sharper focus. And I'm glad I'm with you today, but many of you know I should now have been in the meeting that's going on right at this moment, my team's there, in Riyadh. So it is building brick by brick by brick. So in Baku, we were reminded that the COP process remains indispensable, irreplaceable, as a mechanism through which we will achieve progress. But it cannot stand alone. We must complement COP and Paris with our wider diplomatic, political, and legal efforts, which offer a new avenue for progress and inspiration. The Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting this year in Samoa demonstrated just how international diplomacy can amplify climate action. Remember that Samoa is a small island developing state in the middle of the big blue Pacific with only 200,000 people. And what they did was quite remarkable, because when our leaders came together in Samoa, they pledged ambitious ocean protections. They laid the groundwork for coastal adaptation strategies, and they committed to ratifying global agreements like the High Seas Biodiversity Treaty. And these are not just declarations. They are the building blocks of sustainable future, uniting 1/3 of the world in a commitment to action which does not reply or rely solely on the UNFCCC. And I want you to remember the journey that we started on in 1989 in Langkawi. It is that same journey. And these declarations give the Secretariat their mandate for action and delivery. And we are all aware of the International Court of Justice, the ICJ hearings on climate change that are underway as we speak. They represent a moment of groundbreaking capacity. By seeking legal clarity on states' responsibility to protect the environment for future generations, these hearings are creating a new frontier for accountability and justice. And we are watching with intensity, and we are ready to ensure that the legal advances translate into real world action. Together, these platforms, which are the COPs, the CHOGMs, the ICJ, can create a virtuous circle of diplomatic momentum, each reinforcing the other and spurring meaningful change. Now, as we look ahead at COP30 in Belém, we must take the lessons of Baku and apply them with urgency and precision. So many people have asked me whether I am optimistic or pessimistic, and my answer is always the same: I'm neither. I'm determined, absolutely determined, because we have to be clear. This is about choice. It's not that we can't do it. Do we choose to do it? Do we choose to stand together? Do we choose to merge the data that we have and use all our ingenuity, our energy, our courage to get this done? Or do we choose not to? And so there are a number of issues that we have to face and overcome. Firstly, we have to bridge the delivery gap. Promises must become promises kept. The Commonwealth will continue its work to ensure that financial commitments are not just accessible, but transformative, especially for SIDS and the least developed countries. We have to unleash innovation, from satellite technology to AI. We must harness the full power of innovation to drive scalable solutions at speed. And these tools can empower vulnerable nations to adapt and thrive. And I want to give you just one example. The Commonwealth has been working with UNITAR, UNISAT, the British Space Agency and others in order to use geospatial data and the analytics to help small member states make applications which they would not otherwise be able to do. So we managed to make an application on behalf of Fiji for a nature-based seawall. Why? Because we need time. We need time. And usually these applications could take anything from 2, 3, 4, 5 years. We were able to make the application using both the geospatial data by putting it into an AI simulator, make the application, submit it to the Adaptation Fund, and have it granted within 12 months, 5.7 million. That, for a small island developing state, is important. We have 25 small states. 23 of them probably need nature-based seawalls. So if we can get the money, the seed corn money to make the application, we could, technically, within 12 months, help 23 of those 25 countries. So it's possible. We have to foster inclusive leadership. Our youth negotiators, our gender-responsive climate action network, and indigenous partnerships are not just programs. They are the future of climate diplomacy. We've got to elevate new diplomacies. Platforms like CHOGM and the ICJ hearings must not only complement COP, but inspire it. Let them remind us that diplomacy, at its best, is a bridge between vision and delivering real change. We have to have courage when we face and call for action, because, ladies and gentlemen, the scale of the challenge is immense. But so, too, is the scale of our opportunity. For all the frustrations of COP29, it affirmed a truth we cannot ignore, that the climate process, however imperfect, remains our greatest hope for collective action. This is not the time for cynicism, it's the time for courage. Courage to act decisively, courage to lead boldly, courage to believe that we can do it. In Belém, nestled in the lungs of our planet, we need to do more than negotiate. We need to find the highest quality of agreement since Paris. And we need to prove that this generation has the will to reshape the trajectory of history. We may be the first generation to truly feel the impact of climate change, but we have to accept we're the last generation to be able to do anything about it. And the Commonwealth stands ready to play its part. We will bring our ideas, our energy, and above all, our faith in what humanity can achieve when it acts with purpose and principle. The road ahead will not be easy, but together, I believe, we can reach a new destination, not simply one of survival, but one of renewal and hope. Everything I have seen in the last almost 9 years of being Secretary General of the Commonwealth, and I will demit office on the 31st of March of next year, tells me that Nelson Mandela was absolutely right. The impossible is only the impossible until it's done. So I know, I hope, and I pray that we can do this, and I commit to doing everything I humanly can to make sure we do this. But let's not fool ourselves. It's down to us, each of us. Each of us gets to choose. I sometimes say we are all jointly and severally charged on one indictment to save this world. I am determined to plead not guilty for failing. I know all of you, because you're here, are going to plead not guilty too. And I thank you for everything you've done, everything you will do, and everything I know you're going to do to make sure this isn't a dream, it's a reality. So thank you very much.
Baroness Scotland, thank you so much. I speak on behalf of the entire audience present for such a powerful and moving address and a rallying call, not just for understanding what has taken place at COP29, what we hope will take place at COP30, in that wider historical context of all the other climate summits that have gone before and will continue to come after, but also to reflect on the power of partnership and collaboration and what we must do together, what the Commonwealth does so successfully, even though they're not responsible for the emissions of the world, but yet represent over 1/3 of the world and the impact that will receive as a result of rising temperatures. But that rallying cry around working together is something that we want to reflect on also at the Climate Action Coalition. As we held this post-COP summit for the second time in partnership with King's, I'm delighted to work together with Franz, Bobby and the team, not just to bring together the panels and the speakers together today, but also to publish that new research on attitudes towards climate change to demonstrate what is opportunities to look forwards, what are areas of concern we need to focus more on in the future. And the Climate Action Coalition seeks to convene both governments, ambassadors like yourselves, and as I said, also the private sector, business and industry, to focus on those real-world solutions that we can deliver in the next 60 months. Putting aside 2050, though 2050 is important, 2030 is what matters, and we'd be delighted to continue that partnership for the future. Climate Action hosts a number of events across the calendar year. We have the Sustainable Innovation Forum at Paris at the end of April that we host in partnership with the UNEP Finance Innovation, UNEP FI. Also the Climate Innovation Forum that takes place in the Guildhall on London Climate Action Week, one of the centrepiece events. Also the Sustainable Investment Forum in North America as part of New York Climate Action Week, and of course the Innovation Zone at COP, where increasingly businesses and organisations and the private sector are coming together to find those solutions, to be able to deploy them in countries like the Commonwealth. Baroness Scotland mentioned obviously that collaboration, not just in the skies above us in space, but also around future land use. And it will be deploying not only the legislation and regulations we need to unlock private finance and public finance. Many of the panel discussions have touched upon what that will look like for the future, but also to provide the incentives and the policy frameworks to unlock the opportunities for businesses to be able to come forward and to provide those solutions for the countries that need them. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. I hope this can be just the start of a continued conversation into 2025. As part of that, please do continue to join us now in the reception that's going to be held in the room across the hall, where we can hopefully begin to have those conversations about what needs to happen, what must happen in the year ahead. Thank you very much.